Hi and welcome my Varieties 1 class to a new session in Varieties 1. Okay, so we are actually still dwelling on the language of conversation. Last time we had a kind of a little introduction about the nature of spoken language in relation to written language, okay? And we saw like these two varieties of language, spoken and written. They are completely different, they are completely poles apart. Each of these varieties has its own code of aspects and characteristics. All right, so in the previous lecture we talked about some elements of layout and a spoken language, and we saw that in contrast to written language, spoken language doesn't have any features of, for example, paragraphing. We don't have paragraphs, we don't have titles or subtitles, we don't use punctuations. All right, and we also don't use graphological devices such as underlining or italics or bold typing. All these tools actually are not used in spoken language, they are rather used in written language. All right, then we moved on to talk about the uh, the nature of sentence structure in spoken English. Okay, and we saw that it's very much characterized by its grammaticality, and we explained this with so many examples from extracts A and B found on page 29 and 33. Okay, so when you read these two extracts of conversations, you found out that there are multiple examples of grammatical English. Okay, and so these are some of the characteristics of a spoken language where we actually can rightly use grammatical features or structures in our speech. So we saw again in the previous lecture that usually there are no well-formed grammatical sentences in conversation. That is, many sentences actually do not have subjects, or the sentence is suddenly interrupted without having been completed. Um, if you like read these extracts that you have in your book, you will find that most of the sentences are basically fragments of speech. Okay, sometimes you cannot even describe them as sentences. Okay, anyway, so we will go over these grammatical examples that we detected last time. We'll go over them, but the most important thing about this lecture today is that we will be learning about their stylistic function. All right, because these grammatical are seen as marked features. So, in the previous lecture, we saw that the most prominent aspect of spoken English is its grammaticality. Now, this sounds quite shocking, but this is true. Spoken English is characterized by its grammaticality. All right. Now, when you find like something grammatical, that means this linguistic feature is marked. Okay, there is something wrong about it, something that goes opposite to the normal or to the ordinary use of language, that goes or that runs counter to the rules. All right, now this is actually very important in the analysis of spoken extracts. Now, whenever you perform your stylistic analysis to any given text or extract of spoken dialogue, remember to take up this aspect in your mind about the grammaticality of spoken English. All right, so let's move to the next slide and find out more about this. Now, this list actually presents some of the examples that we studied together in lecture 2 about, the grammatical aspects of spoken language. All right, so examples of grammatical linguistic features. All right, now we studied this in depth in lecture 2 with some supporting examples from the extracts A and B found on page 33 and 29. All right, so the first thing is the omission of the subjects. We saw that in spoken English, most speakers tend to omit the subjects, okay? Like it, glad to see you, happy to find you. All right, so we don't actually use, or we don't include the subject. We rather actually omit it when we speak, okay, which doesn't actually apply to written language. In written language, if you write a sentence without a subject, that means this is completely wrong, unacceptable, and this thing is doesn't have even like a room for negotiation about it. Okay, the second thing is the repetition of the subject. We saw different examples and we studied them where we have some sentences or some strands of sentences where we have the repetition of certain words or the repetition of the subject. I think that, all right, or I mean that, all right. So we have this constant and recurrent repetition of the subject I. All right. We also saw some examples of the omission of the object. Okay. I noticed. All right. Like when we had these examples of I noticed. So you have noticed is a verb that requires a direct object, but in this example in spoken English, because the interlocutors, that is to say the speaker and the hearer, understand what they are talking about, so I don't have to say the object. All right, so I noticed, that's it. Wrong subject verb conquered, like you was busy. Okay, you was busy. Yes, this actually happens in spoken English by English speakers. You might actually find Americans or English people use these forms of language. You was busy yesterday. Okay, now you think that they don't know English, but no, it's just the way how they use their oral language. Okay, these violations are permissible as long as it is in the sphere of spoken language. We also have the misplacing of the subject or of the verb, separation of subject and verb from complement, the incompletion of sentences. Some sentences are just cut off sadly. We have ungrammatical insertions, omission of a grammatical word, like we saw in relative clauses, or words like which and that. All right, so these are just so briefly some of the examples of the aspects of grammaticality in spoken English. If you want to find out even more about them, go to your previous lecture where you have detailed analysis about all these examples. Okay, so these are some linguistic features that are marked by their striking grammaticality. Now, the most important concept and the most important question in this session today is, what is their stylistic function? All right, now we examined spoken language in terms of the grammaticality of their sentences, but we need to understand what do these stylistic linguistic features stand for. Okay, what is the function? Why do we have them? What do they represent? What do they stand for? You remember in lecture 1 we explained that every stylistic feature has a stylistic function. So a stylistic function of any stylistic feature tells us what do these stylistic or linguistic features stand for. What do they suggest in the text? What do they reveal and tell us about the text or the variety of language we are analyzing? The answer actually is here. The stylistic function of the grammatical sentences of conversation is multiple indeed. They indicate first spontaneity of speech, that speech is a process that is very spontaneous. When we speak, we don't write, we don't edit, we don't modify, we don't change, we don't rephrase. We actually speak spontaneously. All right. They also indicate, or these grammatical aspects indicate the informality of spoken English, the non-fluency of conversation, a good proportion of grammatical errors. They show hesitation on behalf of interlocutors, those who speak and write, frequent interruptions of speakers to one another, breaking the turn-taking principles. Okay, so these random pauses that could be caused, you might actually, when you read an excerpt or an extract of spoken dialogue, you might actually sometimes find, you know, those dots, those blanks and dots. These dots stand for pauses. Okay, means there is a kind of stop. These pauses may refer to breath taken, framing one's ideas and utterances. So when we speak sometimes and we want to reformulate or remodeling our ideas, we actually stop. Okay, and we think. So this actually also suggests a kind of time for self-correction, hesitation, rethinking, and so, speaking of all these grammatical features of spoken language, doesn't actually suggest that, native English speakers do not know how to use English, or that they use it in a wrong way, or that they are not familiar with the grammar. This is actually 100% natural, because we actually do this, like in Arabic language. Maybe we can write fluently in Arabic without any problems, but when we speak, this is actually quite natural that we sometimes need to pause, that we sometimes repeat certain words, that we sometimes, utter some incomplete sentences. So this is actually very natural and part of our speech. Okay, this is like very deeply rooted aspects of our speech. Okay, so all humans actually do such aspects in their spoken language. All right, so this is not to say that spoken language is incoherent, as some might conclude. In fact, despite the disjointedness, disjointedness actually stand for the fractions or the incomplete utterances that we sometimes articulate, or the ungrammaticality of spoken sentences, discourse. They are still coherent and form a coherent conversation with the aid of sign language, hand gestures, silence, and facial expressions. So although we actually speak with all these maybe grammatical features, or these aspects of spoken language, but in the end we understand each other when we speak, and we come with a conclusion about a certain topic and so on. And this is actually with the help of what we call sign language. And sign language stands for hand gestures, silence, facial expressions, and so on. These are very much aided tools as when it comes to speaking. Remember that hand gestures, silence, facial expressions, and are technically used or called paralinguistic features. Okay, so all these, you know, language of body language, using the hands and facial expressions and so on, they are technically used, or they are technically called or termed as paralinguistic features. As for sentence types in spoken English, in fact, all types of sentences like declaratives, questions, negatives, and imperatives are all common in conversation. The imperatives, however, are less common than the others. You know, the imperatives, like, the type of sentence we use when we give instructions, like, you do this, listen to me, work on that. So these types of sentences are quite uncommon. Many examples of the different types of sentences can be found in the two extracts A and B. Please find them and send them to me. One more prominent feature is the use of loose coordination. Okay, so coordinations in grammar refers to words like and, or, but. Okay, and loose stands for something that is uncontrollable. Okay, you cannot control it, so something that is excessively used. So another distinguishing feature of sentence structure is the recurrent use of coordinations to join clauses and short minor sentences into long sentences using and, or, but in particular. Okay, now if you just like record yourself speaking English, you will find yourself that you are overusing coordinations like and, but, or. This is also part of the natural process of spoken language. We tend to use these coordinations loosely. Alright, so since coordination is continuous, recurrent, and joins all types of clauses together into one long and usual and punctuated sentence, it is called loose coordination. Example in extract B, lines 24-25, we have a very interesting example here. Okay, for a very unusually long sentence, and this sentence is joined all together by means of coordinations, which makes the sentence very loose. There was nothing vivid about the conversation you could remember, and you met someone again, and you think I've heard before. Where on earth? And it was only coffee, or, and I would still go on and go and on with this example. So and or in this example are intentionally colored in red and capitalized for emphasis. Now, what is the stylistic function of this stylistic feature? Okay, because loose coordination is also a stylistic feature in spoken language. So, what is its function? Why do we have it? What does it suggest? The function of loose coordination is to reflect the spontaneity, informality, and unity of individual utterances of conversation. So instead of the speaker says, simple short sentences, no, we try actually to stick together all our ideas into one very long sentence. And how can we stick them? We stick them by means of coordinations like and, or, but. As for sentence connectivity is also marked in spoken English. All kinds of connectors are used, especially the following ones. We have coordinate connectors, especially and, or, also, and to. The function or the stylistic function behind using them is to join clauses and sentences and to add information as well as clauses to each other to form one unit in one sentence. We also have logical connectors such as so that, of course. Alright, so more examples are found on page 40. The stylistic function of these logical connectors is to indicate logical results and conclusions as a means of persuasion. Alright, so when we speak and we come into a conclusion, so we say so that's why I couldn't, for example, bring my homework today, or that's why I couldn't sleep last night, and so on. So we use it for logic, and they are also called logical connectors. We also have contrastive connectors such as but. We have a kind of contrast like but, in fact. And these are the most popular connectors that comes however or yet nevertheless actually and well. There are many examples actually, you can find them in your core textbook. They have the function of contrasting ideas and utterances with one another. As when it comes to emphatic connectors, the most frequent of these are indeed, absolutely, really, truly, for sure, surely, no doubt, and of course. They are all actually used to emphasize speech and to attain the credibility of listeners. Okay, so you would always like find speakers would use these emphatic connectors like absolutely, really, truly, to show that they are in accordance with each other. Summarizing connectors like finally, in conclusion, or to conclude, or in sum up, to sum it up, in the end, at last. Um, Speakers actually would use them for the functions to give a summary or a conclusion for what one has said, or to mark the end of conversation. So this brief survey of the most important connectors confirms their importance in spoken English because they aid speakers to achieve coherence of content and cohesion of sentences and utterances as well as clauses. As when it comes to verb phrase, generally the verb phrase is simple to follow and redundant, which helps speakers to communicate more easily, fluently, and with clear understanding. This can be illustrated by the following detailed analysis of verb phrase. First of all, the overuse of two auxiliary verbs, be and have. These two actually verbs are excessively used. Many main verbs in conversation are am, is, are, was, were, and have, has, had with all its forms. Um, as found in extract A, for example, you was it, for tag questions. See more examples on page 43. The current use of core common verbs like think, got, know, seem, go, want, or used to. So, to sum it up, generally verb phrases are simple. We mostly depend on verbs, the two auxiliary verbs have and are, or be. Okay, the verb have and be, and also as when it comes to verbs in general, we use very common and core, I would say, verbs. Some examples: I went up to Victoria, used to suffer, not when I knew him, and you will find many multiple examples on page 43. When it comes to tense, the most frequently used tenses in conversation are the simple present, the simple past, and the present perfect. The most remarkable use in the construction have got, which is perhaps the most characteristic tense of spoken English. You've got your last one. Have you any friends? You've all got. Alright, so have got a very recurrent, actually, I would say, tense or phrase. And for the many common phrases are the simple present, simple past, and present perfect. Okay, voice. Voice here refers to the active or passive voice. Now, usually the active voice is dominant in spoken English because the speakers tend to be very subjective, alright? So, however, they can occasionally be objective and use the passive voice. Notice that in the two extracts, there is no single example for the use of passive. All the utterances are active. This confirms the rarity actually of passive voice in subjective informal in this subjective informal variety. So generally speakers would always use the active form, while the passive is somehow rare in spoken English. Now, modal verbs are abundant, especially those of probability, such as would, can, could, may, might. I'm sure, like you, are all familiar with these modal verbs. Now, the function of probability modal verb is to reflect the uncertainty of utterances and speakers and the modesty of speakers. Modal verbs of obligation are also widely used, like should, must, have to, ought to, and others. And the main, actually, stylistic function of obligation modal verbs is to give utterances and speakers more authority and commitment. Okay? So, as you have noticed, verb phrases are all simple, common, and informal to facilitate understanding and make communication as easier and feasible as possible. Alright, so finally, this is your home assignment for next week. Analyze the same material on page 68 in terms of sentence type, sentence connectivity, verb phrase, tense, voice, models. What you're supposed to do is actually to find examples as the examples we did in the lecture. Okay, in case like you couldn't find, for example, modal verbs or anything like that, mention it. You can write to me like I couldn't find any examples of modal verbs. And if you found that, mention these modal verbs with the extract, with the number of the line, okay, plus the function of this, the stylistic function of this, for example, modal verb in the text. All right, the same actually with voice, verb phrases, the examples of the verbs used. Did you find are there so many like core verbs, and so on. All right, so see you next week.